I own a 2-bedroom apartment on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Austin. On clear mornings, I can see the Congress Avenue Bridge from my kitchen window while I drink my coffee before heading to work. I bought that apartment at 29, on my own, with a down payment I saved over 4 years while still sending money home every single month. I am a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company. I make good money, and I have built a life that I am genuinely proud of. I say all of this not to brag, but because you need to understand who I was before I tell you what happened, and more importantly, who I became after. My name is Vivian. I am the middle child. My older brother is 38. My younger sister is 24. My parents immigrated from the Philippines when my brother was 2 years old, and they worked themselves to the bone so that all 3 of us could have opportunities they never did. My father drove a delivery truck for 22 years. My mother cleaned houses on weekends on top of her full-time job at a laundry facility. They were good people. They are still good people. This story is not about them. This story is about my brother, Derek, and the night he decided that my worth to this family could be measured in dollar signs and nothing else. Growing up, Derek was the golden child. He was charming, athletic, funny in that way that made rooms light up. Everyone loved Derek. Teachers loved Derek. Neighbors loved Derek. My parents looked at Derek the way people look at a sunrise, with this quiet, reverent awe, like he was something miraculous that had happened to them. I don't say this with bitterness. I loved my brother. I genuinely did. He had a warmth to him that was real, not performed, and when he turned that warmth toward you, you felt like the most important person in the world. The problem with Derek was that he had never once in his adult life been told no. He married his college girlfriend, Renee, when he was 25. She was sweet, well-meaning, and completely under his spell, in the same way everyone else was. They had 2 kids, my nephew Marcus and my niece Lily, who are now 14 and 11 respectively. Derek opened a home renovation business when he was 27. For about 3 years, it actually did well. He had a knack for the client-facing side of things, the presentations, the handshakes, the follow-through on promises. But Derek was never good with numbers, and he was even worse at saying no to himself. By the time I was 26 and had just landed my first real job in tech, Derek's business was struggling. He came to me with a loan request for $18,000 to cover payroll and equipment. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my brother. He showed me a repayment plan on a spreadsheet, all very official looking, and I believed him. He paid back $4,000 of it. Over the next 6 years, the loans kept coming, sometimes framed as loans, sometimes framed as just help me out until the next project pays out. There was $22,000 for a new work truck, $11,000 to cover a tax penalty his accountant had miscalculated, or so he said, $35,000 to avoid a lawsuit from a client who claimed his crew had damaged a load-bearing wall. Each time, there was an explanation that made sense, a promise that felt genuine, and a repayment that either never came or arrived in small, irregular dribs that stopped entirely within a few months. By the time I was 32, I had given my brother approximately $240,000. I know this number exactly because I kept records. I am a software engineer. I keep records of everything. Every Venmo, every wire transfer, every cash envelope. I had a spreadsheet that I opened sometimes late at night, not out of resentment, but out of a kind of bewildered accounting I was doing on myself, trying to understand how I had gotten here. I was also co-signing. When Derek wanted to take out a small business line of credit 2 years ago, his credit score wasn't good enough to qualify on his own. He asked me to co-sign. I said yes. The line of credit was for $80,000. He used it, made the minimum payments for 8 months, and then the payments started coming late. I was getting the late notices in my email because I was the co-signer. I covered the shortfalls 6 times, 6 separate months where I transferred money into that account, so the credit line wouldn't go into default and destroy my own credit rating. My sister knew about some of this. She would occasionally say things like, "Viv, you need to stop letting him do that," and then go quiet when Derek walked into the room, because nobody in my family was really willing to confront Derek about anything. My mother worried quietly. My father occasionally said things like, "Derek will figure it out, he just needs more time." My father had been saying this for 11 years. I also paid for things that were never framed as favors. I paid for Lily's orthodontics $12,000 because Renee mentioned at Thanksgiving that they couldn't afford it, and Lily was being bullied at school about her teeth. I sent Marcus a laptop for school, and then another one the following year when he said the first one had broken. I paid for the family vacation to Florida when my parents' 40th anniversary was coming up, because Derek had announced he was planning it, and then admitted 2 weeks before the trip that he didn't have the funds. I paid for the whole thing and told my parents it was from all of us. I was not a martyr about any of this. I want to be clear about that. I did not walk around the family with wounded eyes collecting silent credit for my sacrifices. I did these things because I loved my family, because I had the means, and because somewhere deep inside me was a version of the little girl who watched her parents work themselves raw so we could have better lives, and she felt a responsibility to keep things from falling apart. But I was also, without fully admitting it to myself, trying to buy something. Not love, I know better than to call it that. Something more like security. Like belonging. Like proof that I was valued. I had no husband, no kids. I was 32, career-focused, and still figuring out what I wanted my personal life to look like. My family was kind about this most of the time, but occasionally Derek would make little comments. Nothing cruel on the surface, always delivered with that warm, laughing ease that made everything sound like a joke. Viv's married to her laptop. Viv doesn't need a partner. She has her savings account. The kind of thing that sounds like gentle teasing in a family that's laughing, but lands differently when you're lying awake at 2 a.m. wondering why you feel invisible. Last April, my cousin on my mother's side got married. The wedding was held at a venue outside of San Antonio, about 90 minutes from Austin. It was a beautiful event, outdoor ceremony, string lights, 3-piece band, the whole thing. My entire extended family was there, somewhere around 60 people, aunts and uncles and cousins I hadn't seen since before the pandemic. Derek had pulled me aside earlier in the week to tell me he needed help covering the hotel rooms for himself, Renee, and the kids to attend. 4 nights, 2 rooms, about $1,100. I transferred the money without much thought. It had become reflexive by then. He asked. I gave. We both moved on. The wedding dinner was warm and loud and full of the kind of joy that big family gatherings can generate when everyone is happy and well-fed. I was seated at a table with Derek, Renee, their kids, 2 of my aunts, and my parents. Halfway through the reception, during that liminal hour between the formal dinner and the dancing, when people are relaxed and slightly wine-loosened, the table started talking about everyone's lives. My Aunt Gloria asked me about work. I told her about a project I was leading, something I was genuinely excited about. She listened, asked smart questions, and said she was proud of me. It was a warm moment, and then Derek leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink, and said in that easy, performative way of his that gathered the table's attention like a spotlight, Viv's the real success story in this family. Makes all that tech money. He said it the way people say things they mean as compliments, but are actually making an announcement. We call her the family bank. Isn't that right, Viv? A few people laughed. Not everyone. My mother didn't laugh, and I saw her face go still in a way I recognized, but several people did. My uncle chuckled. My aunt smiled politely. Renee laughed and said, "Well, we are grateful," in a tone that somehow made it worse. Marcus, my 14-year-old nephew, laughed the loudest. Then he said, because apparently 14 is old enough to understand theater and young enough to have no filter. Yeah, Aunt Viv basically pays for everything. She's like our sponsor. The table laughed again. Someone said that's too funny. Derek grinned at his son with this proud, amused expression, like Marcus had said something clever. I smiled. I held my glass and smiled, because that is what I do. I hold the room together, I keep things smooth, I do not make scenes at family weddings, but something happened in my chest in that moment. Not a break, more like a click, the sound of something locking into place that had been sliding around loose for years. I finished my dinner. I danced with my cousin during her first dance as a married woman. I hugged my parents goodnight and told them I loved them. I drove back to my hotel room, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened my spreadsheet. $243,000. That was the total I had given my brother over 6 years, not counting what I'd covered through the credit line. If you added the credit line shortfalls, It was closer to $260,000. I also co-signed on that line of credit, which had a current outstanding balance of $62,000, and which Derek had been making inconsistent payments on for the past 8 months. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I opened my notes app and started writing. Not angrily, methodically. The way I approach a complex problem at work: identify the variables, map the dependencies, decide what outcome you actually want. By the time I fell asleep, I had a plan. The following Monday morning, I called the lending institution that held the small business line of credit and asked to speak with someone in the co-signer management department. I explained that I was the co-signer on the account, that the primary borrower had been chronically late on payments, and that I wanted to understand my options for removing myself from the account. The representative walked me through the process. It wasn't simple. Co-signing agreements are designed to be difficult to exit for exactly this reason, but there was a pathway. I could formally request co-signer release, which would trigger a review process and require Derek to either qualify independently or find a replacement co-signer. If he couldn't do either within 60 days, the lender had the right to call the balance due immediately. I submitted the co-signer release request that afternoon. I did not tell Derek. I also called the financial advisor I had been working with for the past 3 years and asked her to help me get a full picture of every financial instrument that had my brother's name connected to mine in any way. It turned out there were 2. The credit line and a small joint savings account my parents had opened years ago with Derek and me both listed, which had about $4,000 in it that I had contributed and Derek had never touched. I had forgotten it existed. I withdrew my share of that account and closed my access to it. Then I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Derek, not yet. To myself. I wrote down every financial contribution I had made to my brother over 6 years, with dates, amounts, and what they were for. I printed it out and put it in a folder. I wanted to have it, not to use as a weapon, not to wave in anyone's face, but because for years I had been operating on a kind of willful amnesia about what I was doing and what it was costing me, and I wanted to stop doing that. I wanted to see it clearly. 3 weeks after the wedding, Derek called me. He had received notice from the lender about my co-signer release request. He was, to use a gentle word, upset. "What is this?" he said, before I'd even finished saying hello. I told him I was removing myself from the credit line. "You can't just do that," he said. "If they call the balance, I can't cover it. You know that." I told him I did know that. "Viv." His voice shifted into that warm register, the one that had always worked on me. "Come on. You know I'm working on getting things stabilized. I've got 2 big projects closing in the next month. I just need a little more time." I told him I'd heard that before. The silence on the phone lasted long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then he said, in a quieter voice, "Is this about what Marcus said at the wedding?" I told him it wasn't just about that. I told him it was about $243,000 over 6 years, and about a credit line I had been subsidizing for 8 months, and about the fact that I had been referred to as the family bank in front of 60 people at my cousin's wedding, and my brother had laughed like it was a great joke. Derek said, "I didn't think you'd be so sensitive about it." That was the moment I knew I had made exactly the right decision. I told him I wasn't sensitive. I told him I was done. I told him that I loved him, that he was my brother, and that I hoped his business recovered, but I was no longer going to co-sign for him, lend him money, cover his shortfalls, or be available as a financial safety net for decisions I had no part in making. I told him this calmly and without tears. Then I said goodbye and hung up. He called back 4 times that evening. I didn't answer. I texted him. I said what I needed to say. I'm not going to say it again. Take care of yourself. What happened in the following 2 weeks was, in a darkly educational way, instructive. Derek apparently told my parents that I had blindsided him and pulled the rug out from under the family. My mother called me crying. My father called me in a measured, formal tone and said he hoped I had thought this through. Renee sent me a long message saying that I was destroying the family over money and that she had always defended me to people who said I was cold. That one stung, not because I believed it, but because of the implicit threat in it, the suggestion that my warmth was something I had to earn, and that she had been the gatekeeper. Marcus sent me a TikTok of a woman counting money sarcastically. I did not respond. I also received a message from my sister, who said, I think you did the right thing. I'm sorry I never said something sooner. That message made me cry, in a way none of the others had. Because it was the first time in a very long time that someone in my family had spoken to me like I was a person and not a resource. I did not enjoy any of this. I want to be honest about that because I think the version of these stories that gets told sometimes implies that the person who finally draws the line feels a surge of pure, triumphant power. I did not feel that. I felt grief. Real, messy, complicated grief for the version of my family I had always been trying to maintain with my money, the version where everyone was okay, where Derek would eventually figure it out, where being the one who gave made me indispensable and indispensable meant loved. That version of my family had never existed. I had been paying for a performance of it. What actually existed was a brother who had learned to rely on me so completely that he had stopped seeing me as a sister and started seeing me as a system. What actually existed was a family dynamic where my contributions were noted with gratitude only when they were absent and otherwise assumed. What actually existed was a 14-year-old boy who had been raised to see his aunt as a sponsor, a word that should never describe a family member because the adults around him modeled that exact relationship without shame. 2 months after the wedding, Derek's line of credit was called by the lender. He was unable to qualify independently and unable to find a cosigner. The outstanding $62,000 became immediately due. Derek had to liquidate some business equipment to cover part of it and negotiate a payment plan for the rest. His business took a significant hit. I know this because my mother told me, in the tone of someone reporting a natural disaster, in hopes that I'll feel responsible for the weather. I did not feel responsible. I felt clear-eyed in a way I hadn't in years. What I did next was something I had been thinking about for a while, and the letter I'd written to myself had crystallized it. I took the money I had been sending to Derek every month, which had averaged about $2,000 monthly over the past year, and I set up an automatic transfer into a new investment account. I also contacted a nonprofit in Austin that provides tech scholarships to first-generation college students and made a significant donation in honor of my parents. Not for credit, not for recognition, just because I had money that was finally mine to direct, and I wanted to send it somewhere it would grow into something real. I also did something I had been putting off for 3 years. I signed up for a ceramics class. It sounds small. It was not small. I had been telling myself for years that I didn't have time for things like that I had responsibilities, that my weekends were for recovering from the work week and being available if family needed me. The ceramics class was on Saturday mornings, the first time I walked out of that studio, with clay on my forearms and a lopsided bowl I had made with my own hands. I stood in the parking lot in the October sunshine and felt something I couldn't immediately name. I think it was ownership, not of the bowl, exactly, of the morning, of the choice, of the particular small joy of doing something just because I wanted to, with no return on investment expected or implied. My relationship with Derek is different now. We speak occasionally holidays, the kind of family events that are unavoidable. He is polite, cooler than he used to be, the warmth dialed back to a kind of professional cordiality that actually tells me everything I need to know about where the warmth had been coming from all along. Renee is pleasant in the way people are pleasant when they have chosen to move on without having apologized. Marcus is a teenager, and teenagers are their own weather systems. I don't take it personally. My parents are slowly understanding. My father, who spent 22 years driving a truck so I could have choices, sat across from me at dinner 3 months ago and said, unprompted, "Axe time. I think you were patient longer than anyone should have had to be." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I could have hoped for from him, and I held it carefully. My sister and I talk more now than we have in years. We go to brunch on the second Sunday of every month, and we talk about real things: her job, my ceramics class, our parents, our futures. It turns out she's funny, actually funny, not just in the background of Derek's performances. I had missed knowing her as a person. Here is what I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in any part of this story. The money was never the real thing. The money was just the language I was using to say something I didn't have other words for. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be irreplaceable. I wanted to be so woven into my family's structure that they couldn't imagine their lives without me in it. And the terrible, clarifying truth that the wedding taught me is that being the person who pays for everything does not make you irreplaceable. It makes you infrastructure. Infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. I was not built to be infrastructure. I was built to be a person. I am 33 years old. I have a 2-bedroom apartment with a view of the Congress Avenue Bridge. On Saturday mornings, I make uneven, imperfect, beautiful bowls out of clay. I have a sister I am genuinely getting to know for the first time. I have colleagues who respect my work. I have a financial advisor who recently told me that if I continue on my current path, I can retire comfortably at 55. I have a life that belongs entirely to me, and I am learning slowly, imperfectly, like everything worth learning how to live in it, without apologizing for its edges. The family bank is closed. There is no reopening date scheduled. And for the first time in a very long time, I am not managing the distance between who I am and who my family needed me to be. I am just living, quietly, deliberately, on the 14th floor, watching the bridge in the morning light, drinking my coffee, taking up exactly as much space as I have earned. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is, finally, everything.